right, good morning, everybody. If you're here for the turtle presentation, you're more than welcome to move up a bit if you'd like. We got plenty of, actually, yeah, if everybody could move up, that would be great because there are some things that I want to hand out that you can get to see up close. Pete, if you could leave this set up above me on. Yeah, that's good. Yep. Okay. All right, so good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here today. We're going to talk about the turtles of Connecticut. Turtles are a very interesting group. Obviously, they're reptiles. They are also ectothermic. That's the scientific fancy word for saying, quote unquote, cold-blooded. So ectothermic species, their metabolism is driven by essentially by the sun, by outside sources, right? So how this presentation is going to go, it's actually sort of a two-part. I'm going to give you a very brief crash course in some of the more common turtles or state-listed turtles that you might see here on the landscape. And then Tyler's going to take over, and he's going to talk to you about some Diamondback Terrapin research. I also have some shells that I'm going to pass around. And so again, will be a brief snapshot of some of the species here in Connecticut. So in total, there are 12 turtle species. Now this includes 4 species of sea turtles, which are obviously out in Long Island Sound. They're not typically encountered all that often unless you're out on a boat or something like that. So 9 of those 12 are on the state's list of endangered, threatened, and species of special concern. So their populations are not doing great, and they are of concern to the Wildlife Division. And again, for the sake of time, being that we're only here for an hour, we're not going to go through every single species, but on the left are the turtles that you typically find inland, the northern Diamondback Terrapin, which, as I mentioned, Tyler's going to talk to you about as well. That is a species that lives in brackish water. And then on the right are our 4 sea turtle species, which again are not as commonly encountered. So I'm going to try to hit on some of the more common species that you typically find in the wild. So we'll start here with the very grumpy looking common snapping turtle. So this species is widespread throughout Connecticut, and typically the species that can adapt well to a variety of habitats are the ones that tend to do well as far as their population goes. So pretty much any type of aquatic freshwater habitat you can find the common snapping turtle in. So they're almost exclusively aquatic, but with that said, they prefer areas where it's very slow moving water. So like wetlands, swamps, things like that. It's not really that common to encounter them in fast moving streams and rivers, although they do occur there, but they tend to prefer the slow moving water habitats. So they're also a temperature dependent sex determination species. I know it's early and that's a bit of a mouthful. It's abbreviated as TSD. So essentially what that means is the average temperature of the nest will determine the sex of the offspring. So in the case of the snapping turtle, if the nest is maintained roughly around 68 degrees, a majority of those young are going to be female. If the average temperature is around 70 to 72 degrees, meaning the average temperature of the nest, because the female turtles, early spring, they come out of the water, they use their back legs, they dig a shallow hole and they lay their eggs, they cover the nest, and then they leave. There's no parental care involved, right? So that at that point, the young are on their own. But if the nest is maintained between 70 and 72 degrees, it's a good combination of male and female young. And then if the nest is, over 72 degrees, a majority of them you'd expect to be males. So that's essentially temperature dependent sex determination. And so what I'll do actually is I'll pass around. I have some shells. Obviously, just be careful with them. But this is the common snapping turtle. This is pretty small as far as, that's definitely more of a juvenile as compared to an adult. So then we have the eastern painted turtle. It's North America's most widely distributed turtle species. Males are interesting. Males typically have, if you ever see a turtle in the wild and you get an up close look at it, and just by looking at it, if you're unsure of, is it a male or a female, the eastern painted turtles have very, very long nails, the males do, and they actually perform this sort of elaborate mating ritual where they sort of wave those nails in front of a female in hopes of attracting her. And then the females will lay their eggs from May and through July. So now sometimes, 90% or so of turtle nests are predated on. So if you've taken any, biology courses and you've learned about Darwin, you've learned about overproduction, right? Why do certain individuals produce more offspring? Well, the reason for that is because they're obviously all not going to make it to adulthood and they're not going to have the opportunity to reproduce. So unfortunately, 90% of turtle nests are lost to predators, and that's normally normally the common culprits for that are raccoons and skunks. And then I have a painted turtle shell that I will. Oh, thank you, Jean. Just be careful, that one's a little loose. So the wood turtle is a state listed species, and it gets its name because of its, so this word carapace is something that you may not have seen, but carapace refers to the top half of the turtle shell. And so if you look at the wood turtle here on the right, you can see the texture, right, of that shell. It almost looks like wood grain. So that's where the wood turtle gets its name. This turtle is a little bit different, say, than the snapping turtle as far as its seasonal movement patterns go. Early spring and over winter, this species lives in more fast-moving water environments. So rivers, fast-moving rivers. And then later in the year, they actually transition from a pretty much aquatic lifestyle to they start moving across the landscape in very, very thick brush, and they spend a lot of time on land during the warmer times of the year. So seasonal movement patterns vary between species. So I put this little note in there: do not underestimate turtle resiliency. So, at the Wildlife Division, we do conduct wood turtle surveys at the same sites over and over again every year to try to monitor the population in some areas. And there was actually one wood turtle that was missing both front appendages and just basically had these little stubs, and yet was still able to power its way and move upstream. So they are very, very resilient. They can survive pretty serious injuries. I don't have a wood turtle shell. And then we have the eastern box turtle. So you can tell this turtle from a lot of other species because of the high dome carapace. This is a terrestrial species. They do spend some time in water, but usually it's just to soak. They can swim. On occasion, people have actually documented them in ponds, but it is pretty rare. They're pretty much going to be occupying very early successional habitat. So found in well-drained forest bottomlands and open deciduous forests. And so with this species, their home range is typically limited to 2 acres. They really just occupy the same space. And so that's why, as far as development goes, conservation concerns, when you have a lot of development in areas, these turtles aren't really capable of, say, okay, well, 1.5 acres of my home range is now all housing. I'm just going to move over here and start living here. They don't necessarily adapt well to that, which is why development is a major challenge for the box turtle. So this is I just want to mention this. So the colored part of the shell, the turtle shell, is actually covered in what are called scutes. And so it's basically the same material. It's protein, keratin, like your nails. And so underneath the scutes is the actual bone. And what's really cool with the shell is that you can see the spinal column on the inside. So this is a box turtle shell, and certainly when you're holding it, you can see that it's more dome-shaped. It's not as flat as some of the other species. Where did I put my clicker? Right here. And so what's really interesting about the box turtle is that the bottom half, the plastron, there's this, and this laser pointer's not working, but this line here, this seam, so the turtle's head would be here. This is the bottom half of the turtle. It's referred to as the plastron. it can actually close like a drawbridge. And so you can see this box turtle doing just that. So, you know, in the event that it feels threatened or a predator's nearby, it can actually pull and close that front part of its shell. And that's obviously a big advantage because if you think about it, this turtle's spending just about its entire life on land. And so it can't swim away from predators the way other turtles can. So that's a unique adaptation that can keep it safe from predators. So at the Wildlife Division, we also conduct box turtle surveys. We basically visit the same area every year to monitor individuals over time. And so that tool that I'm using is referred to as a caliper. And I do have that here. I should have passed it along with the box turtle shell, but I'll leave this up here if there's some time at the end. It's a way for you to take measurements, and I can demonstrate that at the end for the sake of time. And then I also have some data sheets so you can see some of the information that we're collecting in the field, again, to monitor box turtles over time. So other native species that, again, I don't really have time to get into, but we've got the top left there is the Diamondback Terrapin. And my coworker, who's one of our new hires, is going to come up and talk to you about his research with Diamondback terrapins. To the right, the upper right-hand corner is the endangered bog turtle. It's arguably the most rare reptile in all of North America. And there are a few populations here in the state. That information is obviously kept private because they have very, very specific habitat requirements, and there's not a lot of that habitat here in the state. The spotted turtle, which I think is part of your wildlife quiz, is another turtle that, like the wood turtle, its seasonal movement patterns change throughout the year. So early spring, it's going to be in wetlands. This time of year, it's going to actually be in vernal pools, eating wood frog and salamander eggs and larvae. And then later in the year, it actually transitions to other freshwater bodies. So they do move across the landscape, which unfortunately makes the spotted turtle also its population susceptible, because a lot of time development will interrupt those seasonal movement patterns, and it becomes a real big challenge. And then we also have on the bottom right there is the musk turtle, also commonly referred to as the stink pot. And why it's called that, it's a very, very small turtle. I think we also have a shell of that out in the display case, but that's a really interesting turtle. It pretty much spends its entire life in the water. Sometimes you see him out basking. And if you pick it up, it emits this really, really foul odor, hence the name musk turtle, as a way to try to deter predators. So very briefly, that's sort of turtles in some of the more common species that you'll find in Connecticut. So threats to turtles, habitat loss and fragmentation. That's key for wildlife across the board, right? Especially in a state like Connecticut, we're very fragmented. There's a lot of people living in a relatively small area. So the more development that takes place, that's putting more strain and pressure on turtles. Illegal collection, pet trade. So we've actually recently partnered with U.S. Fish and Wildlife to try to enhance some messaging, because unfortunately turtles are wrongfully taken or illegally taken out of the wild, and that's having a really negative impact on their populations. Wild turtles do not make good pets. They belong in the wild. Mortality from car strikes. So again, late spring, early summer, when females are moving, looking for a place to lay their eggs. Unfortunately, a lot get hit by vehicles. That's a big challenge. And then invasive species. So we have the red-eared slider that is not native. It was very commonly sold at pet stores. People have these pets for a long time. They get too old. They figure, hey, I don't want it anymore. And they, unfortunately, they let it out into the wild. And so they're actually now overwintering, and they're actually now reproducing in the state. And it's really unclear at this point what kind of impact. It's safe to say there's going to be some type of negative impact they'll have on our native turtles. But the red-eared slider, and then this is a yellow-bellied slider. This was a very, very big turtle. I know there's nothing to really give you a scale, but it's thought that they could easily outcompete native turtles for basking sites. being that the sliders tend to be a bit more aggressive in nature than, say, the painted turtles, and certainly the spotted turtles. So if there's a turtle crossing the road, what should you do? Well, first and foremost, your safety comes first. If you can safely avoid hitting it, that's ideal. You can stop and help it move across the road. Again, only if it is safe to do so. Your safety obviously comes first, but you always want to move it in the direction it's heading. So even if this table represents the road and the turtle's right here and it's facing this way, it's not going to do you any good to just move it back here. It knows where it wants to go, so always place it on the side of the road that it's heading. And then lastly, we do have folks in the state that are licensed rehabbers. They're specially trained, they volunteer their time, they're very dedicated to helping wild turtles that get injured, helping rehab them with the hopes that they can be eventually released into the wild. All right, so with that, I'm gonna actually take a break here. I'm gonna turn it over to my coworker, Tyler, and Tyler has a really great, unique experience working with a particular species of turtle, which is the Diamondback Terrapin, which is what I mentioned earlier. So I'm just gonna unclip this mic. You can clip that however you see fit. I also have this clipper here. So.
All right. So I'm Tyler Mahard. I'm a new biologist with the outreach program here. I did a lot of wildlife technician work before this in Connecticut and New Hampshire. A lot of that was with turtles. If you guys have questions at any point, feel free to put up a hand. So Paul just mentioned road mortality. So this one, luckily, we were able to save from road mortality. This picture I was traveling in a state vehicle with another biologist, and we saw it attempting to cross a highway. Does anybody know what species of turtle this is? Actually, Terrapin is the part of the scientific name. Anyone want to guess what the common name of this turtle species? So this is an eastern box turtle, and it was about to cross the road on a highway. Luckily, there wasn't a lot of traffic, so we were able to pull over, go and get it, and then bring it to the other side of the highway. That's not always the case. Sometimes I see them and I'll stop and pull over, and they'll already be out and then get smashed before I can get to them, which is really sad and frustrating when that happens. So again, does anyone have a pet turtle here? No. If you're thinking about it, it's something you want to think carefully about because they live for a really long time. And I've seen this happen to people where they get a pet turtle and then they can no longer take care of it, and then it's hard to find a home for it. So a lot of times what will happen, some people, it's not legal, but they'll release them in the wild. So this photo I took in a pet store in Connecticut not too long ago. These are sliders, which are an invasive species. I don't think it's actually, Paul, do you know if it's legal?
It's now illegal.
Right.
To sell sliders, but unfortunately there's some other species now taking its place. I want to say it might be map turtle. Don't quote me on that.
Okay.
Essentially now a different species take the place of slider.
But pretty similar, right? So releasing them into the wild is bad for the turtle. If it's been in captivity, it's not used to living in the wild, so there's a good chance it's going to have a hard time there. But unless it's a red-eared slider, because obviously they're able to adapt fine. And then another thing to think about and appreciate is that turtles have been evolving on our planet for over 200 million years. And we have different species because they're adapted to specific ecosystems. And it's just impossible to recreate that in captivity. So you might think about, is it really ethical and in the turtle's best interest? All right. So this is another thing that happens a lot. If you find a turtle, you might think it's really cute and want to take it home. That's not legal to do, unfortunately. It needs to stay in its habitat in the wild. and collection, both because of the pet trade and because of illegal trade in turtles, is a major issue for wild populations, and it does contribute to us losing populations of turtles in the wild. So another big issue with collection is demand for turtles overseas in other countries where they're actually eaten or sold. So some of our native turtles are captured and sold for considerable amounts of money overseas, and it's a major problem that mostly the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service deals with. And also, a wild turtle is unlikely to do well in captivity because it's adapted to its specific environment in the wild. And it's used to interacting with all the other species that occur in its ecosystem. All right, so anybody know this species? Did I already say it? Anyone want to guess? So this is a diamondback terrapin. This is probably a younger one, probably a male. The males are a little bit smaller. So here's a female, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about the diamondback terrapin's life cycle now. So like most of our other turtles, they spend most of the time in the water, but the females come onto land to lay their eggs, and they usually don't go too far from the water. So you can see right now she's digging with her back legs, and she'll deposit her eggs in the hole that she makes there. And then, as Paul mentioned before, most turtle nests are eaten by predators. And with diamondback terrapins, it's interesting because they're like eating and growing in aquatic systems, brackish water, usually salt marshes. So they're taking all those nutrients that they kind of assimilate in their body and use to create eggs, and they bring them onto land. And you get, in some areas, there's well over 100 nests, and most of them are eaten by predators. So it's kind of an interesting nutrient cycle, and where they bring nutrients from the aquatic habitat into the terrestrial habitat, and then mammalian carnivores will eat it. So things like skunk, raccoon, fox, coyote. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Yep. So the ones that do make it, this is what you get, a cute little baby diamondback terrapin, which is a really rare thing to find. And at this size, they actually, we don't know a ton about their biology and habits and habitat use when they're at this size, but it's thought that they spend most of their time on land. And then as they get bigger, they rely heavily on salt marshes. So this is actually probably an adult male terrapin in a salt marsh. And salt marshes, we have a bunch of them in Connecticut. They're really important habitats. They're really diverse. Lots of species occur in there and are found in there, and lots of species that don't live there all the time rely on salt marshes for food. So birds and mammals in particular. But terrapins spend a lot of their time in there, and some stay in there all the time. Here's just another example of terrapin habitat. So this is a tidal creek in a salt marsh, and you have areas like this, exposed banks, where they'll bask, often in groups. So you can see a group of terrapins soaking up sun rays, because being cold-blooded, they need to use the sun to regulate their body temperature. And all their prey species are found here. That includes things like fiddler crabs, mollusks, so like probably mussels, snails, blue crabs, and they'll also eat some plants, possibly fish. Again, we don't know a ton about what they eat in different parts of their geographic range, and how that varies from place to place. And here's just one swimming in the water. I think that's actually in the same creek. So here is some terrapin nesting habitat. So this is like beach dune habitat. It's kind of important habitat for nesting, not just for terrapins, but also some shorebirds like piping plovers. And so you can see that there's vegetation, but there's also exposed areas of kind of sand and broken shell material that's suitable for nesting because they can dig it. So one concern, major concern, especially for terrapins, is sea level rise, which I'm sure you folks have heard about, climate change. So this is kind of going big picture for a little bit, but why is this sea level rising? And I'm going to connect this back to turtles. Just wait a minute. So there's lots of ice. So if we think about the cryosphere, that talks about all the ice on the globe. So there's Greenland is a huge ice sheet of frozen water, and all that because of global warming, climate change due to human activity, that it has been gradually melting and causing the ocean levels to rise, in addition to thermal expansion. So if you got, most of you probably have learned in your science classes that heat makes things do what? Like if you heat up a piece of metal, expand, right? Yeah, so water doesn't expand as much as metal when you heat it up, but it does too. And there's so much of it in the ocean that's a contributing factor to the sea level rising. This is the confusing graph, don't get overwhelmed. So these are basically a couple different models and predictions for sea level rise, specifically for Connecticut. And this shows, so it's based on some measured data too during the time frame that we're here. So we got the year 2000 there, and then all the way to 2100 here. And of course, we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future. So things like statistical models are used to try and predict that. And there's a couple different possible scenarios. One of the lower ones is about 2 feet of sea level rise. Middle of the road one is between 3 and 4 feet, so a little over a meter. And then the worst case scenario is 7 feet, which we hope doesn't happen because a lot of the coast will be underwater and a lot of terrapin habitat will be underwater and gone. Not just terrapin habitat, but habitat for other species that rely on salt marshes and coastal Connecticut. So here's an example. Notes went, oh. So that is satellite imagery of some of Connecticut's coast. No, I didn't get my notes on that part. That's all right. Has anyone looked at satellite imagery, played around on Google Earth before? Yeah, it's pretty cool and interesting to look at. I like maps and geography a lot. So there's a couple different potential terrapin habitat types here. We have an estuary, so we got a river flowing into Long Island Sound. So here's Long Island Sound. Here's a river. We got salt marsh. We have a barrier beach. So that's where like maybe potential nesting habitat is. And then, so one thing that wildlife biologists and environmental scientists like to do is use mapping software and classify land cover types. And that's what this map shows. And this is kind of an approximation of current conditions. So all the red is dry land. The dark red is developed, so with like houses and buildings and things. The lighter red is undeveloped. The sand color is the beach. And then this stuff in here is salt marsh. We got different types of salt marsh because they're affected by tides, which tides vary throughout time of year. So sometimes you get a big tide, the water comes up really high. Sometimes it doesn't come up quite as high. So we got transitional salt marsh here. So this is kind of an more upland. It's probably not as wet. And then we got irregularly flooded and regularly flooded. which you could see you could get that from this picture. See, there's more water. You got a mixture of vegetation and water here. And this is a little higher elevation, so it's not as inundated. So the next slide I'm going to show is this, but modeled for the year 2100. So there's a big difference, right? So you still have salt marsh, but it's mostly regularly flooded. So the habitat there is going to really change, which is going to affect the way species use it. We can also see the amount of beach decreases. And then we have this purple showing up, which is flooded, developed dry land. So a lot of that, even if it's developed, terrapins still probably nest there. They'll nest in people's yards and things if they need to. So a lot of that is getting regularly flooded. So nests, if there's nesting there, it's going to get most likely washed out by the tides, and the nests won't be viable. They won't hatch. So this particular model has a weird name. It's called the Sea Level Affecting Marshes model. If you're interested, you can Google it. There's like an online viewer that you can play around with and look at. And there's also it modeled for different, I'm just showing the year 2100, but it shows, different time frames too, and also different conditions depending on severity of sea level rise. But again, it's a model, so this doesn't mean that this is going to happen. It's just kind of a guess, so we can get an idea of what we might be dealing with. So to kind of summarize, sea level rise it is happening. So it undoubtedly will affect many coastal nesting areas for terrapins. We just don't know how much and where specifically. And one of the challenges there with salt marshes, like conserving salt marshes and terrapin habitat in general, is that Connecticut's coastline and much of the East Coast is heavily developed. So lots of buildings, lots of houses, which makes it more difficult to allow that habitat to move inland, which it probably would do if there was just something like a forest that could erode. But we have people with an interest in living there that want to find ways to protect their homes and keep their homes there, despite the sea level rising. So that's one of the challenging aspects of wildlife conservation. So what we kind of really need, and this is a lot of you guys could, if you're interested in this, you could help with this. There's like tons of really cool research questions you could do here with terrapins, or this issue in general of sea level rise. But it would help us conserve terrapin populations if we had a better understanding of specifically where they're nesting, and if we started monitoring that over time and how that is responding to sea level rise and changing as the habitat changes over time. Any questions? Feel free to just ask them if you have any. I guess I will, there's more time, so I will go on and talk a little bit about road mortality. So road mortality is also an issue for terrapins. And there's several places in Connecticut that we know of where this is an issue. So right here we have basically a causeway that goes through a salt marsh. This particular road I'm really familiar with, and people like to drive really fast on it. And it's an issue because turtles are on either side of it. And along the edges where they mow, you have areas where they're able to dig and lay their eggs. So they like to do that along roads. That's really common for many turtles, especially snapping turtles, but it's common for terrapins as well. Unfortunately, that means they end up crossing the road, and oftentimes they'll get whacked by vehicles. So if you're out driving and you're passing turtle habitat, be alert. And in general, when you're driving, try and be alert. It can make a big difference. So here's a nest on the side of the road. This one was dug up by a predator. You can see the eggshells there. That's the edge of the road. That's the asphalt. This is a post from the guardrail. And then there's a carapace fragment next to a littered water bottle of a turtle that unfortunately got whacked. I had more gruesome pictures that I did not include. So luckily, people do care about it. And I've talked to a lot of people on that who drive by that particular road, and they stop and they're like, "Hey, we're really concerned about turtles getting whacked here." So that's really a nice thing to see. And they did put some signs up, which can help remind people, and sometimes. But a sign can only do so much. I think a better solution would really be putting some fencing that would keep the turtles out of the road. All right, so I encourage you guys to ask any questions you might have.